Hi, everyone. I'm going to give people a few minutes to join us. Thank you for being here, and then we'll get started. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of our Anti-Trafficking Summit. For those of you who still don't know who I am by now, my name is Christine Anderson, and I am the Anti-Trafficking and Runaway and Homeless Youth Coordinator at OCFS in the Division of Youth Development and Partnerships for Success. In that role, I serve as the Program Manager for our Safe Harbor New York program, and that is what brings me with all of you today. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our 3rd day, session 1 of our 6th annual Anti-Trafficking Summit. A few housekeeping things. There's 2 sessions every day this week, one at 12:30 and one at 2:30, with the exception of Friday where we only have a 12:30 session. All of our Zoom links have been sent out for those who registered. If for some reason you have not received a Zoom link for a session you registered for, please let us know and we will get that to you as soon as possible. If at any point you encounter IT issues with the presentation, you can email info@welfareresearch.org and we will put that in the chat for you and we will help you as soon as you can. If you're still in the presentation and you're having issues, you can type a note in the chat and one of us will be glad to help you. Or you can raise your hand if you know how to do that. All of our presentations are being recorded and will be posted a few weeks after the event in both HSLC as well as our new and exciting OCFS YouTube channel. Certificates are issued after Summit by request. And one thing that I actually did forget to mention yesterday and Monday was that in order to give you a certificate, we need to know which sessions you have attended. So please include that in your email request. We will be verifying participation after the fact. We do not issue them. There's not standard procedure. So if you need one, you need to request one. Also, we will not be issuing certificates until all of Summit is complete. And that does take us a couple weeks, so please be patient with us. And if you don't receive one in a couple weeks, feel free to reach out, but we do need some time. Next week, you will also receive a post-summit survey. Please, please, please use your opportunity to provide us feedback as we do take it into account when we plan future trainings and events. Lastly, and most importantly, all of our participants are automatically muted upon entry during the presentation. Each one of our amazing presenters has about 45 minutes of content, and that leaves us time at the end for question and answers. You can put your questions in the chat at any point during the conversation, but we will not get to questions until the end unless something is asked of you during the presentation. We ask that you try to hold them, but if you need to put it in right away, you can do that. If for some reason we don't get to your question, we have access to the chat and we will get you an answer from our presenter and get it to you after the presentation. If you don't know where your chat screen is, it is in the bottom corner, right-hand corner, of your screen. Please make sure it says it is directed to hosts and panelists so that we can see your questions. With all of that said, I'm going to introduce our first presenter for the day. She comes to us from the New York State Department of Education. Her name is Lisa Pingelski, and she is a Social Studies Associate in the Office of Curriculum and Instruction. In her current position, she's the point person for Erin's Law, which is what we will be talking about today, as well as a regional coordinator for the Seal of Civic Readiness pilot program, and the statewide coordinator for the Teacher of the Year program, the Yavner Award, and the New York State United States Youth Senate program. Prior to this, she comes to us with 17 years of experience as a classroom teacher in an urban school setting, teaching multiple levels of social studies. And she also provides professional development to staff and has served as a curriculum leader. I'm thrilled she's here with us today. Turning it over to Lisa.
Thank you so much. Welcome to the Erin's Law presentation. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start. Oh, I apologize. So as many of you know, Erin's Law is named after Erin Marin, who is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and realized that education was getting realized that only education was getting about abuse was from offenders, and has been on a decade-long journey to get lawmakers to implement some sort of law to teach about child sexual abuse. So in August of 2019, New York State became the 37th state to sign Erin's Law into legislation. New York State's law, Chapter 187 of the Laws of 2019, also known as Erin's Law, requires public schools to teach children child sexual abuse and exploitation prevention classes to students in kindergarten through 8th grade. This legislation requires that these prevention classes include practical and age-appropriate instruction on how to recognize the warning signs of child sexual abuse and exploitation, with resources on how to find help. So a lot of this presentation will show you some of the resources where you could look into utilizing for districts. If you're involved in working with districts, you can certainly go to these resources. You can use resources that you currently are using or that you may be using or may know of. But these are just some suggestions, some ways to help with getting involved with districts. Erin's Law is intended to help children, teachers, and parents in New York State schools identify sexual abuse and to provide awareness, assistance, referral, or resource information for children and families who are victims of child sexual abuse. Erin's Law addresses the need to prevent sexual abuse of students in grades kindergarten through 8, which requires defining and addressing the wide range of behaviors and experiences related to sexual violence, such as child sexual abuse, sexual assault, and child sexual exploitation. So in the spring and summer of 2020, the New York State Department of Education worked with partners such as Department of Health, the NYSED Offices of Student Support Services, Office of Children and Family Services, and the New York State Center for School Health to develop a website and resources. The New York State Department of Education has prepared an Erin's Law website with curriculum resources to support this endeavor and provide assistance to schools and educators. So like I said earlier, there are resources available on the NYSED's website, including grade-banded curricular benchmarks that will assist in guiding instruction and lesson development, as well as a suite of available curricular resources appropriate for various grade levels. So part of this presentation, we're going to look at the grade-banded objectives, and we're going to talk about them, and then we're going to see how many people have been able to implement, or how many people have been able to, what people know about them, and if they've worked with their districts in regards to these grade-banded curricular benchmarks. So the NYSED encourages local school districts to have advisory councils that include parents, school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers, school board members, school personnel, students, and community members to give recommendations in the development of the instruction designed to educate students, parents, teachers, and other personnel about the prevention of child abuse and child sexual exploitation. NYSED also encourages local school districts to partner with families and communities to make decisions about sexual abuse education that are developmentally appropriate and consistent with community values. Local school districts have the flexibility and responsibility to identify appropriate content and resources to implement instruction aligned to the benchmarks that were created. Although curriculum remains a local decision in New York State, the resources provided on the website can serve as a foundation in the curriculum development. NYSED recommends that educators create their own Erin's Law curriculum to best fit within their school and programs. and in accordance with the existing New York State standards in health education to fully comply with the intent of Erin's Law. So again, the website, resources, grade banded objectives have been developed with the input, review, and help of partners like New York State Department of Health, New York State Office of Family and Office of Children and Family Services, and the New York State Center for School Health. The tools and resources can be used in schools to ensure students in kindergarten through grade 8 have the instruction, support, and knowledge needed to protect themselves, as well as to seek help when needed. So our first discussion question really deals with like the website and the benchmarks that were created. So I'm curious to see how many people have looked at the website and how many people are familiar with the benchmarks in regards to, the grade banded benchmarks. So if you have used any of them or have reviewed them or tried to help districts with them, if you could write something in the chat and we can have a little discussion on that, that would be great. I'll give you a couple moments to think about it and to type in the chat.
Lisa, I'd also be curious if this is your first time hearing about Erin's Law in general or these benchmarks. That'd be, I feel like I don't know about the rest of your presentation, so I don't want to jump the gun, but I'd be curious to see how many people are also unfamiliar so we can kind of gauge that. I know there's Sue from, I believe that says Washington County. So Sue, if I'm saying it wrong, please. And Chelsea Elliott, who I am very familiar with, welcome Chelsea, are both unfamiliar with the benchmarks. So, and Lisa B says she's consulted with another agency who's working with schools to assist in resources, but she herself has not been contacted. And Megan says she is unfamiliar. Taylor is a bit unfamiliar. And Vanessa, hi Vanessa, is not familiar with the benchmarks. Gwyneth is not familiar. So looks like I'm really glad we're having this presentation. Yes. David, Sophia, Kim, not familiar. So I think it's really, really great that you're here. So thank you everyone for sharing.
Right.
Oh, we have one. Sorry to interrupt you. We use the Child Safety Matters curriculum from the Monique Burr Foundation in the school, but she has not yet looked at the website or benchmarks, if you're familiar with that.
So I am familiar with that. We actually are updating our resource grid as we're speaking, believe it or not. And the Monique Burr Foundation is going to be one of those curriculum that we are going to put on our resource grids for districts to be able to look at. So again, like curriculum is locally developed and it's a local decision on what districts utilize. So if they choose to use the Monique Burr Foundation as part of their curriculum for Erin's Law, that is totally up to them, but it is one that we are putting up on our website. Thank you for sharing that. Excuse me. So if you're unfamiliar with our website, this is just a glimpse of it, and we will go through the benchmarks. But our website is fairly easy to find. It's NYSA.org, and if you go to curriculum instruction, it's right under one of the tabs there. And on our website, for Erin's Law, you'll see a guidance memo for Erin's Law resources. There's an FAQ, and we'll talk about some of the questions on the FAQ, as well as the benchmarks, as well as resource grids for districts, schools and districts, and resources for parents and families. So you can certainly pull from these resources. You don't have to, as long as you are looking at these benchmarks and meeting those benchmarks within those grade levels, we're satisfied. I can show you around the website. We can look at the website a little bit later, so that way you guys can see what it looks like and maybe become a little bit more familiar with it. But our next slide is also a discussion. And I know some of you have already shared, and I appreciate that. So what I'm curious to know is if districts are aware of what you may have to offer to help them implement Erin's Law. And if so, how have you been able to disseminate your material? So if you could think for a moment and share something in the chat, and we can have that discussion, that would be great.
We're getting some answers. Marla says that they have a great relationship with their local BOCES and use them to disseminate their information. Aubrey, we send letters to all of the principals, superintendents, and school counselors offering to meet with them to discuss what they have to offer. They have had community outreach staff members teaching in all of the schools. Hold on, let me see who that is because that's pretty impressive. Emily Thompson, and she provided programs to over 3,000 students last year. Great. Taylor says they have an education advocate trained in One Love, and they present at local high schools. Aaliyah, our CAC partners are doing education in schools around this, as are some of our rape crisis partners. They've also provided technical assistance, but they're taking the lead. Kylie says Facebook, word of mouth from satisfied customers. I implemented the quotes because she used the quotes, just so people know. BOCES, social work. Hi, Mitch. They work really closely with local schools, but there's often confusion about their services. Domestic violence, LGBTQ plus counseling and advocacy, all under one roof, often surprises people. They've done a Facebook Live. Marcia, who I know is in, I always get this wrong, Ontario. Many of our school districts have representation on their Safe Harbor Task Force, which is awesome. And they have a newsletter that goes out to all their school districts. Vanessa says their partners at the Center for Safety and Change provide prevention services. So it sounds like they're utilizing all sorts of different mechanisms. They have an educator who goes to the schools, MDT teams. Sorry, guys, I'm trying to paraphrase for time. CAC community educators. So it sounds like it's all over the gamut, but as per usual, they're kicking butt.
That's great. That's great that they're able to use so many resources and so many different ways to get this information out there. So we really do appreciate that. So we will start with the grade banded K2 objectives. We'll kind of go over them and then we'll kind of talk about them. So I know some of you have said that you are unfamiliar with them, and I'm glad to familiarize you with them. So the grade banded K2 objectives start with students will be able to recognize healthy and unhealthy relationships. Students will understand that abuse can occur in any relationship. Students will understand that their body is theirs and it deserves respect, as well as know that some parts of their body are private. Excuse me. Students will be able to identify and define whether a touch is comfortable, uncomfortable, or confusing. Students will be able to understand how to refuse comfortable touches. Students will be able to comprehend know, go, and tell. Students will know what keeps them safe when on the internet, including not sharing personal information. Students will be able to identify by name 2 trusted adults who can help with any issues or problems. Students will be able to identify the difference between a safe and unsafe secret. When there is an unsafe secret, they must tell a trusted adult. Students will be able to identify adults that they can trust and talk to about uncomfortable touch or unsafe touch. Students will be aware of unknown individuals who claim to know the child or his or her family. And students will be able to understand that abuse, including exploitation, is never the student's fault. So since curriculum is a local decision, like we've talked about, NYSEG created benchmarks to help districts. The benchmarks that are listed on the NYSEG website were developed for guidance purposes. So these benchmarks should be used to help measure students' understanding of the topic. So for example, when I kind of talked about students will be able to comprehend no, go, and tell, the purpose is to keep kids safe. So children need to know that if they feel unsafe or uncomfortable, that they should find someone they trust. So that's kind of what we want to get to. When I talked about students will be, able to identify two trusted adults who can help with any issues or problems, or identify a safe adult if lost, hurt, or in need of help. For example, you might want to have discussions with students on the qualities of the trusting friendships between a child and an adult. Teachers can brainstorm like a list of ideas. So these, a list of adults who that most students in the class would know, like school staff members, parents, community members, that they could tell if something felt unsafe or uncomfortable for them. So these are just some ways that could be implemented into the district, but these are the grade bands for K2. So we have another discussion. So after hearing the grade banded K2 objectives, do you know of any instructional strategies that work best for this benchmark? What are some best practices for teaching or getting these grade banded objectives into the districts? And if you have started to push in, have you found any challenges that teachers or districts may be facing with these grade banded objectives? So if you could think about it for a minute and then maybe write something in the chat, we can have those discussions.
I don't want to speak for our partners, but I know that sometimes the feedback we get and just, especially K2 would be is very heavy for elementary school kids. And I imagine that might be some of the challenges they're experiencing. Emily Thompson shares that the curriculum that they use has a variety of ways that it covers the information, such as songs, videos, group discussions, class discussion. Marcia shares that their Safe Harbor of the Finger Lakes, which is an organization they work with, does so much with the school districts in meeting those objectives. Having been an educator myself, like you, Lisa, I imagine with K2, they're probably using some art therapy and play therapy and dolls to maybe express some of these things, or anything that doesn't seem intense, so to speak. But again, that's just, I've been out of the classroom for a long time, and elementary wasn't my niche, but I would think that that's probably one of the they're using.
So one of the good things about this is that there's a lot of objectives, right? There's a lot of objectives that we are asking teachers to cover, but for K2, it is grade banded, so the teachers can pick and choose which ones to cover in kindergarten, which feels, more appropriate for that level, and then first grade and second grade. So the good thing about having them grade banded is that they do have a time span to get through all of these objectives. And they have, they can utilize whatever curriculum, whatever teachers, districts feel appropriate to make sure that these grade bands are being addressed. I know that there is one I'm not advertising by any means, so please don't think that. But I know one of our resources is like teddy bear or something. I can't remember off the top of my head. But the good thing about that, it is geared towards K2, K5, K2, and they have a lot of like coloring pages, right? So they talk about these little stories, and then teachers can talk through the objectives and kind of get the word out. So our partners that we've worked with to get these resources up have really done a great job putting these resources, summarizing these resources for districts and teachers to look at to see what could potentially work for their students. So that's one great thing about these resource grids, and we will talk about them, and I can show you a few of them. We can go through a few of them so people see what's out there on our site. Again, not advertising, but I'm just kind of throwing it out that we did just do some great work putting those resources up. Okay, so thank you. If we move on to the grade banded 3-4 objectives. So what we kind of did when we were writing these objectives, we tried to build off prior. So some of them are repeated because we thought they were very, very important. And some of them we built from the grade band before. So again, students will be able to recognize healthy and unhealthy relationships. Students will understand that abuse can occur in any relationship. Students will be able to identify the bathing suit zone. Students will have a deeper understanding of comfortable, uncomfortable, or confusing touch. Students will be able to use no-go and tell to seek help from a trusted adult. Students will know what keeps them safe when on the internet, including not sharing personal information. Students will be able to recognize that their body belongs to them and they have the right to say when and how someone else can touch it. Students will be able to set personal boundaries and respect the personal boundaries of others. Students will be able to identify and seek help if unhealthy and unsafe behaviors and situations occur, including bullying and abuse. Students will be able to quit or refuse to play games involving inappropriate touching. And students will be able to understand that abuse, including exploitation and trafficking, is never the student's fault. So again, when we talk about, students will be able to have recognize healthy and unhealthy relationships. Districts, whomever pushes in, may want to talk about or may want to have discussions about what a healthy relationship looks like, where you have like communication, trusting an individual, respect, not hurting someone, and an unhealthy relationship looks like. So insults, putting someone down, disrespecting, and obsessing over you. When we talk about students, we'll know what keeps them safe on the internet, not including sharing personal information. Students should understand that when on the internet, not to give out private information or send pictures of any kind, and maybe having a discussion on what shouldn't be sent on the internet. In times like COVID, students in these grades are on the internet all the time. When school shut down, that's all they did. So it's important. We felt it was important that we talk about internet safety and what should be shared versus what shouldn't be shared. But again, how, like I said, how you're doing it, how you push into these districts and what you bring with you is up to the district, like what their curriculum looks like. So again, we just have other questions to think about. And if after we heard these grade band objectives, have you been able to, I'm going to say this a few more times, so I apologize, but was there any strategies that have worked best when you push in or have pushed in the past regarding any of these benchmarks? And have you found any best practices for teaching of these grade bands or any challenges that have you faced? So if you could take maybe a minute, maybe two, kind of think about any of these. And if you have some sort of suggestion you can put in the chat for other people to hear, that would be great. Sorry about that.
Lisa, I think it's awesome that one of the grade 3-4 banded objectives refers to internet safety because, like, as you stated earlier, young people are getting on the internet younger and younger and younger, not necessarily strictly for fun and games anymore, but because it's just the way of the world now, you know, especially after COVID. Kids are on the internet, kids are doing school online. I mean, my nephew is in, oh, this is horrible. I'm a horrible aunt. He is 7, excuse me, and he could probably work a laptop better than I can at this point. So I think it's awesome that that was one of the objectives included. Not seeing much in the chat. I would imagine many of our folks will really have a ton to share when we get to the older grades, because that seems to be the niche that they get to work with the most. But
Yeah.
I like the bathing suit zone because I know that's how I talked to my daughter about it. So I think that that's great.
Yeah. When we were putting these objectives together, I mean, we made sure that the internet safety was on there just because of what is happening, right? I mean, years ago we wouldn't think about doing it, but now when everybody is on it, I mean, I have a stepson who's 7, and I look at him doing stuff and I'm like, oh my God, what are you doing, right? It's crazy, but okay. So, all right, let's look at the 5-6 grade band objectives. So again, we just kind of build upon adding a little bit more, going a little bit more in depth. So students will be able to recognize healthy and unhealthy relationships. Students will understand that abuse can occur in any relationship. Students will be able to describe and understand healthy and safe personal choices. Students will be able to identify and seek help if unhealthy and unsafe behaviors and situations occur, including bullying and abuse. Students will be able to identify safe adults that they can report to when confronted with potentially unhealthy or unsafe situations. Students will be able to use no, go, and tell to seek help from a trusted adult. Students will know what keeps them safe on the internet, including not sharing personal information. Students will be able to refuse to go alone to meet online acquaintances or strangers. Students will understand the basic concept of manipulations and lures. Students will be able to identify different ways that perpetrators might use lures, and students will be able to understand that abuse, including exploitation and trafficking, is never the student's fault. So again, you know, students will be able to understand the basic concept of manipulation and lures. Students may face some type of physical, emotional, or psychological abuse, and you may want to have certain discussions on what this may mean, and may help students be able to notice something wrong is going on. You know, as we get into sorry about that. As we are getting into the older grades, students are facing more and more things, and when we talk about internet safety and we're talking about what can keep them safe, oftentimes they're meeting people on the internet. And I'm not saying, a 5th grader is definitely going to go, but there is that potential that they meet somebody. And then, if we're talking about healthy and safe, like healthy and safe personal choices, you may want to have those discussions on what a healthy choice is, right? So have discussions on what safe personal choices are versus what unsafe personal choices are. So again, these are just building upon the other grade band objectives in hopes that, once they're kind of discussed in earlier grades, students have a better understanding, and we just build upon them. But with the notion that, like I've said in grades K2, that as long as between grades 5 and 6, these are covered, how your district covers them is really, is up to the district. So if they're looking for you for help and you bring these ideas in, and they're covered within these 2 years, NYSED is satisfied with that. So I'm gonna skip this discussion, and we're gonna get to the 7th and 8th, and then we'll talk about these again, and I'll just kind of add in 5, 6 with 7 and 8, if that's okay. unless there are questions regarding these so far. Okay. All right. So in 7 and 8, in the grade banded 7-8 objectives, again, we're going to see, we're asking the students will be able to recognize healthy and unhealthy relationships, including romantic ones. Students will understand how to set personal boundaries and limits on relationships and honor the boundaries of others. Students will understand that abuse can occur in any relationship and understand the various types of manipulation and lures. Students will understand they can stand up for themselves and say no without feeling guilty. Students will be able to help a friend who is in a potentially abusive situation find a trusted adult. Students will be able to identify abuse that may occur in person and online, physical, sexual, emotional, and neglect. Students will identify safe adults and peers or seek professional help such as help or abuse lines, counselors, etc. Students will understand the risk caused by sending requests and or sharing inappropriate material. Students will be able to understand the importance of keeping personal information private while online. Students will know what keeps them safe when on the internet by refusing to post, send, or forward inappropriate images of self or others and know how to set privacy settings on social media. And students will understand that abuse, exploitation, and trafficking is never the student's fault and help is available. So again, if we're looking at, students are going to set boundaries, set personal boundaries and limits on relationships. An example of this would be to maybe have discussions on what personal boundaries are, right? And how to define them and discuss what happens when you have your personal boundaries invaded and or invade other personal boundaries. People become scared, people become nervous, maybe discuss setting limits on all relationships so that the student does not feel that they're being invaded. Another, students will understand abuse, exploitation, and trafficking is never the student's fault. Districts may want to have a discussion on what human trafficking is, discuss what sexting is, and that sending pictures that are inappropriate could be exploitation if those pictures are sent around or if they're used as blackmail. So, as we're getting into these older grades, students are going to, we're asking that students understand more. And we're in an age where they're using cell phones, they're using the internet. And if they're, we want them to not be sending risky pictures. We want them to not be requesting things. And we want them to understand that they can say no, right? I mean, so ultimately we want them to be able to set these personal boundaries and to see that there are different manipulations and lures and to say no and be able to tell trusted adults if they feel that they're in danger. So we're going to look at questions to think about again. So after we heard about the grade 5, 6, and 7, 8 objectives, does anyone have any instructional strategies that work best for these benchmarks that they may want to share? Or do they know of any best practices for teaching these grade band objectives or any challenges that maybe districts are facing? If you want to take a minute, think about it, maybe put those in the chat and we can have that discussion, that would be great.
Yeah, and I'll just share that in the chat. There was a statement. I had a concern that during COVID, students who were learning from home and maybe in a toxic environment, how teaching those objectives actually played out. Because when in school, those students have the safety of the school environment to talk about these objectives, whereas at home, they may not. And that's, I think, the great point that I know we've all talked about in the last year and a half is young people who are now stuck at home with their trafficker, the person exploiting them, their abuser, or they're just not in an environment where they're comfortable sharing that information for whatever reason. So I was going to talk about something else too, but I can't remember what it is now. So, but I think, something that I find as a concern, and we've talked about it in our Safe Harbor programs before, is that in today's society and culture, I have a teenage daughter myself, some things that we might not as adults and professionals think are normal, such as sending dirty pictures, for the young people today, that's normal. That's what they're used to seeing in social media. That's what friends are doing. It's not as outlandish or taboo as it once was, or scandalous, or whatever you want to call it. So I imagine that's a challenge many of these educators are finding when they're working with the older youth, is that to them, this is just part of the course, And then there's that element of peer pressure and wanting to be popular and cool and have people like you added on top of that. So,
yeah. I also have a teenage daughter. Well, she'll be a teenager in a month. And I feel like I'm constantly having those conversations, and I'm constantly saying, if somebody asks, you can say no, and it is your right to say no. And, and going through personal boundaries and trying to make her understand. And, sometimes she listens, I feel like, and sometimes she's like, I already know, Mom. I'm like, okay, well, tomorrow we're going to have the same conversation.
Sounds familiar.
But I also have 2 teenage boys, and I have a 20-year-old, and I feel like I've said the same thing to them. And there's been times when, one of my sons have come to me and said, somebody is sending something, and I'm like, oh no, we're not taking it. And we report it, right? Because I feel like it needs to be addressed. And I think you're right. I think that's a line where some people, at this point in time, what we may think, like you said, is a little bit outlandish, they may think is normal because that's what they're seeing on social media. And I feel like if we're able to get into these districts and explain to them why it's not normal, and although it's on social media, you don't need to do it. I think it's better. They're better off in that respect.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to what you said earlier about teaching them healthy choices and boundaries. Feels right to you and what doesn't feel right to you, and really a sense of empowerment for our young people. Vanessa is sharing social media and reality TV shows make it much more difficult to educate young people on what is seen as appropriate or inappropriate relationships or touch. And that's a great point. I forget all about reality TV shows.
Right.
But
interesting. Yeah, it's because again, you turn it on and it's right there and it's right in your face, and like you said, sometimes the kids want to be cool and whatnot, and they think it's normal, so they're doing it as a result. So that is a great point. Thank you for sharing.
Imagine our folks processing. So if anything else pops up, I'll share it, but I don't want to mess up.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so on our website, I'm just going to kind of walk you through a little bit of our website. And you can find you can find all of our links on here, the links for the resources, right? If you go to the resource grid. So one of our accordions on our website is dealing with the resource grids for schools and districts. So one of the programs that we have is coming from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And there's resources called KidSmart and NetSmart. And every one of our resources will look like this. It'll have the agency, the resource title, the content type, the date published, the targeted grades, if it's research or evidence-based, if it's cost, and notes. So the notes are really great in terms of if you're looking for something quick and you need, you're trying to figure out what would be beneficial for one of the benchmarks. You can certainly see what's there, or if you're looking for a specific grade level, when you go to the targeted grades, you can keep scrolling, because although this one says K2 and 3.5, and then the NetSmart says K12, something like Safety Rocks is really geared towards 3.4. We do have resources that are just geared towards 5.6. There's some that are geared towards 7.8. There's some that are 5.8. So it really depends on what you're looking for in terms of what type of resource. So we do have ones that are free in cost. We don't have a lot of cost ones. We do have more free than cost, but we are starting to gradually increase our resource grid by putting additional resources up there for districts to utilize. Many districts already have some type of sexual abuse curriculum embedded into their health or SEL curriculum. And if they do, these resources may be good to enhance topics that aren't fully covered. So if they're utilizing something different, but one of the benchmarks are being missed, they could certainly check out the resources that are on our website and potentially utilize what's there to cover the benchmark that is missing. We also have stuff for parents. So parents tend to talk to their children about strangers and staying away from people who they don't know, but may not talk to their children about sexual abuse or feeling unsafe and or what they should do in uncomfortable situations. So the NICET has developed a resource grid that parents can easily access to gain or to help them better discuss some of these topics with their children, as well as to gain a better understanding of what Erin's Law is and how it's intended to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation. So again, if a parent, caregiver, family member was looking for resources to use to talk to their child or children, they are embedded into the resource grid that is currently on the NICET website. And that looks very similar. So it just, it kind of goes over different grade levels. It goes over the ages of where the resources are geared towards. So again, the resource grid is for parents, families, caregivers. And it's extremely important that parents, families, or caregivers have the resources needed to educate themselves in child sexual abuse and exploitation prevention. Although it can be uncomfortable to discuss these topics with children, it's important to engage in these discussions and to have open and age-appropriate conversations with children. So what we're seeing is sometimes parents they're not familiar with how to start these conversations. And although I'm sure there are additional resources, these are some resources that just have stuff for parents and families and caregivers. So that way, if you're looking for something to send along to them, you can certainly check out these resources to get something to send home or whomever. But what we're seeing is that, we're struggling. We're seeing people struggle where to start. So this is a great way to give them that beginning. We have another discussion, and that is, what have you been able to do well in collaboration with your local school district's educational community in regards to Erin's Law or implementing any child sexual abuse curriculum or pushing in any of that? So if you could take a moment and maybe put something in the chat, that would be great. Sorry.
Thanks, Lisa. And I will let everyone know, if you haven't seen it yet, we put the link to the awesome resource grid in the chat, so it's easily accessible. You can click on it, open the NICET page, and save it to your internet. I don't even know. See, this is why I need my 7-year-old nephew, because he would know what I'm actually talking about. I'm not a tech person. So if you're looking for that, Autumn says they provide Love 146 or not a number presentations in school, which is very popular. Bookmarks. Thank you, Sophia. That is the word I was looking for. Saved it to be a bookmark. See, this is why I need all of you so much. Liz states that they're maintaining relationships with the school districts to continue annual presentations. I'm a big fan of remembering that we don't need to do things just once, that repetition is key. And when I looked at the grid, I saw some familiar names. We work very closely with NECMEC. Actually, last year in Summit, we learned all about NetSmarts and how to navigate that. NECMEC actually presented yesterday, so it's nice to see some familiar names on there. Krista shares, she thinks that it's important for annual presentations to be given to parents and children, so it makes it easier for them to have conversations. Yes, that's key, Krista, wonderful point. It's not just the young people sometimes who need that refresher or education. It's important to make it so that they can have those conversations outside of school as well. Some of our folks are shy. They don't ever want to brag about all the amazing work they do, but I know that they're all out there doing great work, and I appreciate their humility, but they're all very, very humble. So if they add any more, we can, I will make sure to share so they get their accolades.
That sounds great. Thank you. Thank
You're
you guys for sharing. So we appreciate that. So we also have a frequently asked questions page that we are also adding to as time goes on. So one of the questions is Erin's Law. What is Erin's Law, and is it required in schools? As we know, it is required in schools as of the legislation that was signed into law in August of 2019. Another one is, which teachers are suggested or required to teach about sexual abuse and exploitation? So for students who are in K-6, the elementary classroom teachers, the guidance counselors, the school counselors, social workers, and or any other trained professionals may actually teach about sexual abuse and exploitation. For 7th and 8th grade students, it's recommended that it be embedded within their health instruction. So a health teacher, a social worker, a school counselor, or other trained professional can teach about these subjects in middle school. So the Erin's Law objectives, grades K-8 required to be taught each year. They're not required to be taught, the total objectives are not required to be taught each year. They're grade banded. So by the end of the grade bands, we are asking that districts meet the benchmarks that are indicated. Are the curricular resources in the Erin's Law resource grid mandated materials? And that's no, right? I mean, so NICEAD is giving you suggestions, but curriculum is a local decision in New York State. So there is a traditional of local school district choice in New York State that empowers educators to select texts, identify products, and use a rich array of instructional strategies and activities to meet student learning needs. So New York State Education Department designed this resource grids, the resources for schools and district resource grid to support schools, districts, and educators as they create new curricula. Do you recommend that schools notify families, parents, caregivers about teaching this topic? And it is recommended and encouraged that schools provide a general information to families, parents, caregivers about teaching of Erin's Law so that caregivers are aware of these topics being taught in the classroom and will be able to answer questions children may have at home. And one of the big questions that we keep getting is, are parents able to opt their child out of the activities or lessons related to Erin's Law? So in August of 2019, when Governor Cuomo signed Erin's Law into legislation, it became a law. So all students in grades K-8 in all public schools in the state shall receive instruction designed to prevent child sexual exploitation and child sexual abuse. Therefore, parents are unable to opt out of this requirement. But since curriculum is locally decided, schools have options on how to teach these types of classes and can tailor their approach for students as needed. So what we keep getting is, what if a parent doesn't want their child to learn about it? And unfortunately, parents don't have a choice because it became a law, but districts can tailor how they're teaching it, right? So if you're working with a district and you're in a special needs class and you have to still, you're still teaching about this, you would tailor to the student's needs, which is why we have guidance material to help educators create their own Erin's Law curriculum. So we encourage local school districts to partner with families and communities to make decisions about sexual abuse education that are developmentally appropriate and consistent with community values. And we do continuously update the FAQ page. So if you have questions, and if you have a question, you may be able to find it on the FAQ page. So I would recommend that you review that. So another discussion question, in what ways have you felt stuck or need assistance with opening conversations or collaborations with your local educational communities? So if you take a moment to think about it and want to comment in the chat, we can certainly address that or have that discussion.
This is great. I know that I was previously a school teacher, as I said, long before Erin's Law, so this was not implemented in my curriculum. But I just want to ask a real quick question, and forgive my lack of knowledge. So Erin's Law is, mandated. Is it mandated, or is there funding tied to it? Like you can't get funding unless you do it, or we'll give you funding to do it? Does it apply to public and private schools and charter schools? Like, how does that work?
So it is for public schools and charter schools. Private schools are, not yet. We would recommend private schools. In terms of funding, if it is mandated, so if NICED gets enough wording that a district is not implementing it, it could be, people could go in and discuss it and see what actually is being done, and there could be funding issues, but we'd prefer not to do that. So, I think we are seeing more and more districts are doing something, implementing somehow, some way. And it's not a conversation that, it's not something that has to be taught on a daily basis, how they integrate those grade band objectives. They could be doing, some sort of story, and then they kind of review one of those grade band objectives, and then they're kind of just making sure that they address them all within that time frame.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. And like I've said, we're just continuing to increase the website. We're putting more and more resources on it. We continue to have meetings with the NICED Office of Student Support, Office of Children and Family Services, and the Center for School Health. And if you have any additional questions, you are welcome to email us. Somebody will get back to you. But that's all I have. So if you have any questions, I can certainly address them. And if you think of any questions after this presentation and you want to email, I can give you my personal email, not my personal, my work email. So you can just email me directly. I can throw that in the chat. That way, if you are thinking of something and you want to email me, I can respond. Otherwise, you can definitely email emscurric@niced.gov and somebody will respond.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm always a resource too. I'm happy to make that connection. We do already have a couple of questions. So the first one was asked earlier, and I promised I would do it. Person has a child in 6th grade, and she doesn't believe necessarily this is being implemented in the curriculum. So their question is there a checks or balances system or data being collected from parents, teachers, or students to ensure that Erin's Law is being implemented? It's a great question.
That's a great question. As of right now, there is no data being collected. I can certainly bring it up to my assistant commissioner for her to check into. Maybe there's something that NICED can do to ensure that it is being taught. What I could say is that if you are concerned that it's not being taught, that if you email the EMS Curric box, that's how a lot of things get sent up and checked on. So I would recommend doing that. But that is a great question, and I can certainly recommend something gets created somehow to have that data collection or the checks and balances like you suggested. Great.
Along the same lines, so when Erin's Law rolled out, did the districts have to submit how they plan on incorporating the objectives in their curriculum?
No, and it's a no because curriculum is locally decided. So we don't look at curriculum, and we don't check it like it's being done. We just give them standards and objectives for districts to utilize when they create their curriculum. So we don't check it. We just give them the resources and the objectives to make sure that they address.
So they didn't have to submit like a plan, like this is how we're planning on.
No.
Okay.
No plan submitted.
We have a comment from Mitch. I've experienced that local educators often don't want to talk about, LGBTQ plus identities or concerns, despite the importance of that, because they view personally any form of those conversations as being not age appropriate. There's been a great deal of pushback around the ask coming from local student body for an LGBTQ plus club in a local middle school, for example, which now has 20 students attending regularly. How should we approach that concern about age appropriateness of education around these topics? That was a lot. That was a lot. Mitch, I'm gonna try to paraphrase for you. I think the point is, when they have an idea of of a topic that, as Mitch is discussing, gender identity, for just to sum it all up. And the pushback is it's not appropriate, but we know as social work professionals that gender identity is being talked about earlier and earlier. So we feel it is appropriate. How do we handle that? I guess is probably the best way to say it. Sorry, Mitch, if I butchered that too. Sorry.
Okay. So how do we handle age appropriate resources? I think that's what you're trying to get to.
But when there's
pushback, right? I guess I would suggest maybe just talking to the school administrators and trying to figure out what they believe would be school appropriate, right? Because it is a local decision, and maybe trying to get some sort of panel where you are bringing in communities, members from the community, families, to try to find resources or find something for classroom teachers to utilize. That's all. I mean, I really don't know the answer to that, but that would be my suggestion. And what I find is that the more people that are giving suggestions, that they also can tend to be more comfortable and tend to be more vocal about it. So, if you're able to get more community members and family members involved, as well as the administrators and the teachers on board, with what you think is appropriate, then I think that would be beneficial. But like I said, when we put a resource grid together, we looked at, we went very depth into what we thought was appropriate. And, there are grade levels and age levels in some of ours. So maybe start there and try to build from that respect. I don't know if I answered that directly around, but
it's a tough,
it's a tough question. I would start with maybe the administrators and see what they feel is appropriate. Maybe bring them resources that you feel is appropriate, and then what the administrators kind of have that discussion and see. Oftentimes when we're looking at resources, when our committee is reviewing resources, we often reach out to the people that we're getting these resources from. So for example, if we're looking at the Monique Burr Foundation, we reached out to them and asked them what levels and what age would be appropriate for that. And they're very good at responding back. We've been in contact with a lot of the agents, or a lot of the people for those resources. And what we found is that they're very willing to help out. So maybe also check those people out as well.
Great. Another question, are the objectives included in the curriculum for students that are homeschooled? That's a great question.
That is a great question. I want to say yes, but I don't know that answer. If that person could email me, or I could email you, Christine, and give you an answer. I could find that answer. I do apologize. I haven't been asked that question yet. I want to say the answer is yes, because they still are under a public domain.
Yep.
So I'm going to say yes. I just don't know exactly how that would be done. So I'm going to say yes. If something is different, I will email you, Christine. If you could forward that, that would be swell.
Me too.
We haven't got that question yet, so I do appreciate that one.
Great to think about now, because I know more parents due to COVID opted to homeschool for whatever their own personal reasons. So,
Mhm.
and it'd be interesting to see how that changes when, typically, not always, it is their caregiver now providing the education, not
Right.
outside professional.
Right.
So,
So I want to say yes, but like I said, if there's something different, I will definitely send you something.
great. Thank you so much. Going to give it another minute to see if anybody else has any other questions. I know I found this very interesting. It's so new that I really hope that this is being implemented, and I feel that maybe COVID kind of unfortunately deterred many of the hopefully amazing plans that the school districts had to implement Erin's Law, and not all of that great work continues. And I know our folks are passionate about education and awareness of all of this. So I'm going to wrap us up there for today, because more questions coming in the chat. If you think of a question after the fact, Lisa was kind enough to put her email in the chat. As always, I am a resource, and I can make that connection for you as well. I want to thank so very, very much for all of her hard work on putting this presentation together and being available to us today. And thank all of you for attending. And I will see all of you very soon. Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you for having me.